Okay, welcome to the BOMA Kansas City February membership program, lease negotiation, keeping it on the rails. Please add any questions that you might have to the chat or question and answer functions within Zoom, and we'll get to those at the end as time allows. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Geoffrey Wardle of Clark Wardle. Geoffrey grew up attending public hearings with his father, a planner and land use consultant, from the age of 5. Therefore, it surprised nobody that he specialized in land use entitlements after graduating from law school. Having served as land use counsel to a resort community, Jeff has developed significant expertise in evaluating development and entitlement applications from both the applicant and municipal perspective, a keen understanding for process, and most importantly, the ability to manage entitlement projects through their entire life cycle, from application through approval and even onto litigation. He regularly appears before municipal design review committees, planning and zoning commissions, and the city councils, advancing the interests of both institutional and private clients. He's a past regional and local BOMA president and currently serves as chair of the Government Affairs Committee at BOMA International. Please welcome Geoffrey.
Thanks, Crystal. Well, everybody, glad to be with you. I understand that it's quite cold in the Midwest. It's a balmy 42 here in Boise. We're always, everybody thinks that we're high in the mountains, and we're actually quite balmy and nice. I mean, you can do stuff most of the year round, and we don't get those Midwestern temperatures. As Crystal said, I grew up here. I lived in the Midwest. I went to law school in Ohio and practiced in Ohio, and then decided to move back home. So some quick direction. I'm not providing legal advice. I am not licensed in the states of Kansas or Missouri. My grandfather was born in Peculiar, Missouri, and moved to Idaho as a boy. And I ran the Kansas City Half Marathon in 2009. And I love the World War I Museum. That's really good. And my partner, Heath Clark, is a graduate of Washington University. So we have Midwestern roots for guys that are from Idaho. Both of us are Idaho kids. You know, we grew up, we grew up and run a real estate boutique. And we are a small firm here in Boise, Idaho, but we have a comprehensive real estate practice and have both been very involved with a variety of commercial and other clients that have kept us busy over the years. So, as Crystal said, I grew up with a dad who was a land use planner and a land use consultant and ran development projects throughout the Intermountain West. And so I grew up as a kid keenly aware of the business cycle. I knew, you know, looking back, it's like those times that dad spent more time with us was when things were bad, and the times that he spent less time with us was when things are good. And unfortunately for my kids, I decided to become an attorney, and it seems like everything is always there. So I started my career as a litigator, and I was a deputy attorney general in the state of Ohio doing appellate litigation in the capital crime section, and then moved into commercial litigation and then municipal representation before I moved back here to Idaho in the late 1990s. And became involved with BOMA because of a lease dispute. Became involved with BOMA because we represented a bank who was a tenant in a commercial building, and the landlord had mismeasured, and the lease just didn't reflect the appropriate BOMA standard. Now, the irony is I pick up the BOMA standard, I work us through this issue, and years later, I changed firms and moved to a larger law firm in Boise, Idaho's oldest and largest, in fact. And one of the partners there, he and his brother owned the building that had been this dispute in 1998. And so by 2003, I represented that owner, and we cleaned up the leases, and I did all of their leasing. They have a family portfolio of mid-rise, arguably a mid-rise suburban campus. That's how it started in the 1960s. It's relatively close to downtown though now, and it's a variety of, 2- and 3-story buildings with a variety of private and public tenants. So that's how I got started in BOMA, and I became their lobbyist for this group, and I did all of their leasing. And My early experience, though, was in the retail sector in real estate, because as I joined this firm, they hired me because we represented Albertsons' large national retail grocer based here in Boise, Idaho. And so I did a lot of retail leasing and retail development for Albertsons, and of course the property management issues that come with that. And then about that same time, my former colleague decided to go in-house, another former colleague decided to go in-house with a large electrical engineering company headquartered in the Sun Valley area here in Boise, here in Idaho. And Power Engineers is a national leader in electrical engineering for industrial systems and for power grids. And about that time, Rand hired away my assistant to become a contract administrator. So the benefit of that was I became Power Engineers' national leasing attorney. And Power Engineers is, you would never know from this company how wide-reaching their presence is. They have an international footprint. They have regional offices throughout the United States, and then project offices and construction sites. And so from a hierarchy of leasing, we would negotiate and deal with the big headquarter leases, the big regional leases that were longer term. Then we would have, because they were in such a growth and dynamic approach, kind of those secondary markets where they're entering or they've acquired somebody and we need flexibility on how we go forward. And then we had, anything from a construction wash site in the middle of Oklahoma for a power line we're putting in, or a sublease in South Africa. And so it was a great opportunity to really develop my skills. So what we're going to talk about today, and the genesis of this presentation came from the Great Recession. I've been approached by BOMA, Idaho, to pull together a panel to talk about distressed tenants in 2009. I brought in my partner who she primarily is a lender attorney representing a lot of lenders in bankruptcies. And we put together at the time a very bankruptcy focused presentation that we've given repeatedly to BOMA. But things have changed. And I am now a BOMA fellow, and they ask, what is it that you know? And I'm like, well, I don't know a lot. I know how the standard works. I know how we measure stuff. I couldn't actually measure a building. I know how we calculate in leases. I know how we describe in leases operating expenses, but I couldn't actually reconcile CAM or do any of that. But I do know how we sort through the problems that we have with landlords and tenants. And so that's kind of what I bring as a fellow, is that background. Because the other thing too, with our firm, we have we're a small firm, but we represent large national retailers on a regional basis. We represent small owners. So our clients have portfolios that range from, commercial campuses with 1 million square feet to the 5,000 square foot Class C strip mall that just happens to be down the street. And that gives us some perspective, and it gives us a lot of lessons. So what I'd like to do, Crystal, is can you allow me to share screen? And I'm going to pop back and forth and I apologize, I shared with Crystal that I'd intended to add some cat TikToks and other things to this PowerPoint. It's not the most exciting, but it is what it is. So let's see. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
All right. So when we deal with distressed tenants, the reality is tenants do not become distressed overnight. And what I learned is that when we talk about our distressed and problematic tenants, there are certain things that we should have seen coming. And it doesn't mean that we don't do deals, and it doesn't mean that we don't evaluate where we go and what we do. It just means we need to learn those lessons, and we write them in the little black book of things that's never going to happen until the next time it happens, and hopefully we learn from those. So when we deal with distressed tenants, ideally our goal is, in light of the investment that either we have made or that our our clients that we're managing properties have made, more often than not, our primary goal is going to be to rehabilitate the relationship and keep tenants in space. There are transaction costs, there are TI costs. There's a variety of things that where we've made that commitment, it is better to keep the tenant in place than to terminate the relationship. So how do we avoid those problems? Well, successful leasing is really focused on making not legal decisions, but the right business decision. We need to make the appropriate business decision for the asset, for the site, for the owner, for us as a property manager. And as an attorney at times, I look at clients and go, I wouldn't do this deal, but I understand why you would. And here are the things we need to look out for, because it's not really a legal decision, it's a business decision. And then the real issue is, how do we manage those expectations and not legal rights? Hopefully, once I negotiate a lease, I never have to hear from my client again about that tenant, unless it's an amendment to the lease and it's an amendment seeking to extend the term. But that's not always the case. And then it comes down to, what is your overall portfolio strategy? And this is a difficult conversation at times to have with clients, because obviously the typical strategy is to, have your vacancy as low as possible, have your occupancy as high as you can, and have your rents as high as you can. Well, there's problems with that strategy. If that strategy is all predicated upon, a 100,000 square foot building that's got two 50,000 square foot tenants who both expire, whose leases expire at the same time and who hate each other, you may have a full building, but when those leases expire in 5 years, you are going to have a problem. So it's, what is our strategy for this building? Is this an asset we intend to hold? Is this an asset that we are trying to improve and stabilize so that we can sell it and maybe manage it, maybe do something? One of my major clients does a lot of that, where they are a medical office and office park developer who develops, fills, stabilizes, and then takes them to market. And then we manage those assets for passive investors. And that's good. And it's been lucrative for the client, but at times, it changes our mindset on what we do. And it affects, what the goal is, because the goal is very different for an asset that we intend to hold and keep versus one we do for somebody else. On assets that we intend to hold and keep, we may make riskier decisions. For those other assets, we know what investors want. So it's about doing that. And then ultimately, it's, what is your distressed tenant strategy? So the way that I want to structure this today, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about various concepts related to this, but it's going to be largely based upon personal leasing experiences of things that went wrong, because we learn the most from the things that went wrong. Now, this spring, I took a vacation with my parents. I took my parents to Portugal. Then I met my wife and sons in London, and we enjoyed soccer and entertainment. And then my wife and our college son headed to France. And I came home with our youngest, and my wife and the oldest son returned from France right as the world ended on the 7th of March and everything shut down. And to be honest, we immediately started fielding calls from clients by about the 15th of March about, what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this? We had tenant clients calling us. We had owner clients calling us. And with COVID, what we've seen with COVID is it's exacerbated underlying problems that already existed in the market. It's exacerbated underlying problems that already existed with certain classes of tenants. And it was really the unknown. And so as we headed through March and into April, and we were waiting to understand exactly what was going to happen with PPP and other things, our guidance to clients was to just be patient. Don't take any action. Don't think you need to negotiate anything. Have conversations with clients, with tenants, but let's just wait. Let's wait and see what happens. Be as flexible as you can. And why did we do that? Well, we did that because it's the unknown, and we can't know and we can't solve for the unknown. Now, we did have some difficult clients. We did have some difficult tenants who were already distressed, and the COVID shutdown in March just pushed them over the edge. In fact, we were in the process of shutting down and winding up relationships with a tenant that ran a cycling studio in a retail center in downtown Boise, who we'd had negotiations. They were $70,000+ behind in rent. It was clear even before COVID that they were struggling and weren't going to happen. And of course, about March 15th, they slap a sign on the window saying we're closed. And it became apparent that the tenant and the guarantor of the tenant were doing everything they could to not be found. And we actually had to race to the courthouse and file an unlawful detainer action to take the space back. And, you know, that's going to get identified as a COVID shutdown. But the reality is that tenant had already failed prior to COVID. COVID just is what precipitated that. So how do we learn these lessons? What strategies do we implement in our portfolios and our leasing policies to make sure that we're addressing these issues up front? We can't know everything, but that's where we go. So keeping it on the rails, and the next section I like to call even the best of us get taken. What we're going to talk about is understanding and doing adequate due diligence on your tenants so that we identify future distressed tenants. Because the reality is, and even the best of us get taken, and you'll understand why here in just a minute, but we can identify the problems usually in advance. So I formerly was at a large firm here in Boise, Idaho, developed a relationship with a regional developer based in Salt Lake City, who has done a significant amount of redevelopment work in downtown Boise. We have constructed, and I went in-house and was their general counsel. And about 5 years ago, it just became apparent that the volume of work was such that it made sense for me to be back in private practice and retain the relationship. And so I did. But I had an ownership interest in one of the buildings that we did downtown. And it was a mixed use project that we had undertaken that had ground floor retail, and on top was 50,000 square feet of academic space for the Boise State University Computer Science Department, another 120,000 square feet of a tech company. There was an integration of an expansion of our convention center as part of this project. Just incredibly complex, incredibly challenging, incredibly rewarding project. And I had a 5% stake in it. Well, I've always cautioned my people that we need to think like owners. And this is one where, you know, the hair on the back of my neck was standing up, but the rent was just going to be so good on this space. So we had leased all of the ground floor retail except for this one space that's about 6,000 square feet. And because this project was integrated with an existing 1970s office building, we built this new project that we called City Center. We owned the US Bank Plaza, and we built City Center around the US Bank Plaza. Well, we had a retail space that, again, 6,000 square feet, but it had 3 elevation changes on the interior of it as it stepped back up over the podium and the parking garage and other things. And it has some significant structural members because above it is the ballroom for the convention center expansion. So everybody's like, this is going to be great space. And except it's not. It is hard space to utilize. So we had started with a food hall concept and had negotiated and decided that, you know, if you're going to do a food hall, it's just not big enough. It's just not big enough, and it posed some issues. And then we get a call, and our executive vice president is a very successful former broker manages his own portfolio, is just the smartest real estate guy I have ever known. And Dave Wally comes in and goes, I've got us a tenant. I've got us a tenant, great concept, and they're willing to pay a premium rent. And at that point, I think we all let our desire to get good return on difficult space get the best of us. So I don't know if you had heard, but Rascal Flats got taken in a scam. And we were one of the sites that leased to Rascal Flats. Now, the Rascal Flats scam worked like this. A former mob, I wouldn't call him a mob employee, but a mob informant who cut a deal with the government, gets relocated to Arizona as a protected witness, gets a new name, gets a new identity, and he started doing leases for Toby Keith Bar and Grill. Now, the Toby Keith Bar and Grill, they only opened one, but the Toby Keith Bar and Grill had retained my partner, Heath Clark, to get them a liquor license here for their site in Boise, Idaho. And they make a big splash about Toby Keith is doing all of these bar and grills, and he's going to make appearances, and it's going to be fine and great. Well, Toby Keith, again, licensed his name. They opened one of these because of shenanigans and other stuff that happened. Idaho tightened up some of its rules and regulations on liquor licenses because of the conduct of the owner that was developing this. And so we were all aware of the problems that had happened with Toby Keith. And the next thing you know, 2 years later, in pops Rascal Flats with this great concept. It's going to be a great location. We need all this. And I'm negotiating this lease with their attorney. And I keep saying we cannot have the same problems that existed with Toby Keith on liquor licenses. And I don't need to bore you with it. The liquor licenses in Idaho are difficult to obtain in the city of Boise because of population issues. You're going to pay a lot. Timing and other issues become problematic. And it was a key part of the lease negotiations. So I am negotiating with their attorney out of Las Vegas. The broker that brought us this had done multiple other quality deals with our executive vice president. We are all on board. And I spend about 8 months negotiating this Rascal Flats lease. And I keep saying, we can't do X, Y, and Z because of the problems that happened when Toby Keith tried to enter this market. And of course, they're telling us, oh yeah, that's not a problem. We totally understand. Well, long story short, the same development group that was behind the Toby Keith debacle was behind Rascal Flats. And what happened was this mob informant, who is now in witness protection, discovered that you could convince landlords to part ways with tenant improvement dollars if you offered them enough rent. And so they were just out signing leases for restaurants just to get the TI dollars and never performing. And so Rascal Flats restaurants, they actually, I think they maybe opened one. There were multiple other bad situations. And I kept going back to my client, my partners, and just saying, guys, they are asking for way too much TI money up front. We don't have any control of this. And my people lost sight of the ball, and they're like, oh, it doesn't matter. We just got to get them in. We got to get it moving. We got to do this. And so there were all sorts of red flags. So all of a sudden they go dark. We hear nothing. And then the Arizona Republic does this massive investigation, and we go, man, we all got taken. Well, this broker comes back to my partner, my colleague, our executive vice president, goes, I am so sorry about that. So sorry. But have a great new concept coming out of San Diego that I think would be perfect for your place. It's called DSK. Start negotiating. Discover quickly that DSK is using the same attorney that Rascal Flats had. And I'm raising flags with my client going, guys, you got burned. We didn't end up losing too much money. This isn't too big of a deal. We didn't pre-fund too much tenant improvements because of things that we've done, but we've lost a lot of time. Well, lo and behold, my colleague, our executive vice president, goes, yeah, but I've sent people to this restaurant in San Diego and it's really good. And I go, it might be really good, but how do we know we're okay? And executive vice president gets a call one day from a local Boise reporter who's picked up on the Arizona Republic. And we're like, yeah, we know we got ripped off. And he goes, well, but do you know that the owner of DSK is the girlfriend of the mobster that started Toby Keith and Rascal Flatts? And at that point, you know, we still have now this unfinished space that we've spent several $100,000s on design and other things. But fortunately, we haven't signed over hundreds of thousands of dollars in TIs like some other people did. So what should we have learned from that? Well, first, there were things from the very beginning that caused me concern. We kept asking for financial plans and for financials of the guarantors. And the documentation that we got was okay, but it wasn't great. They were using as a guarantor another restaurateur in Phoenix who wasn't necessarily part of the scam, but didn't have the strength that they needed. We were leery, should have been more leery of how optimistic they were about their ability to do the types of numbers that they thought. We should have been more leery about the quality of their food because we asked to see the menu because we had other exclusives we needed to deal with. And the menu was, you know, it wasn't anything to write home about, and it wasn't anything creative or different. It wasn't anything you couldn't get anyplace else. The only draw to this was the Rascal Flatts name. That negotiated into the lease a performance and appearance fee for Rascal Flatts. That was part of it. And they were guaranteeing that Rascal Flatts would come and do an opening concert. And there were just a lot of bells and whistles. The other thing too that had just been concern for me is how hard they were pushing us on advances for TIs. So even the best of us get taken, and both me and my partner ended up dealing with the same mobster, and our client and my former colleagues and a building I used to have an interest in, we got taken. So even the best of it can do it. Even the most difficult thing is knowing that you're going to have a problem. It was one of those where they wanted the TI money, but they just wouldn't focus on the things that we had to negotiate and deal with. So make sure we understand who our tenants are. It's critical. Make sure we understand the degree of exposure that they have. If it's a new concept entering the market, you know, my former employer and now client, their new rule is we are never going to sign a lease with somebody whose food we have not eaten in an actual restaurant. And I'm like, that's a good rule. That's, you know, if you got to go to Phoenix to taste the food, go to Phoenix and taste the food. If you got to go to Seattle and taste the food, taste the food. Go see it in effect before you cut a deal and do that. And then the other thing too is, you know, is the value of the TIs, do they actually understand how it's going to be, or is it just some number that they're pushing? Because again, with this space, it had some difficulties and it had some challenges, and they kept pushing us to increase the amount of the TI, and would say rather than increase the amount of TI, we will do that as landlord work. And they pushed back on that when it was stuff that, you know, just should have been easy to sort out. We had a measurement issue that they just wouldn't relent on. They wanted an additional area for free. It was space that was enclosed within a firewall, but it could either be utilized for storage or restrooms. And they just were insistent that, you know, that needs to be part of the usable calculation, but not the rentable calculation. And it was all about inflating the TIs. So even the best of us will get taken. Learn your lessons, have a plan, do your due diligence when you're leasing on the front end. Brokers want to get commissions, and this is one where we paid a significant commission. We paid a significant commission that we never recaptured. And again, I think the broker that brought them to us, he's somebody that our firm and my colleague has done multiple deals with, never had a problem. He was well respected. I have no reason to believe that he was in on the fraud, but it still cost us money. So do your due diligence. So the next thing I would like to share is, I call it, when the tenant is in the paper, what do you do? So I represent a small family portfolio. It is a remote owner. Owner is out of Eastern Idaho. Owner has a fairly diverse portfolio. It's not huge, but has some industrial, has some retail, and entered the Boise market looking to diversify, and helped them through due diligence on a couple different acquisitions. They looked at some single tenant retail, they looked at some multi-tenant retail, and finally identified a center. And it's not a center, it's 15,000 square foot strip a mile away from my house. And the client's like, what do you know about it? And I go, that's where we go pick up pizza. And he goes, is it a good site? And I go, it is a good site today. I said it was a very green site when they built it 10 years ago, but everything is infilled around it. And you've got a Walmart kitty corner to it, and you have some other pads, and the facility is full. The rents weren't great, but it was full. And the client is a surgeon, and the client wasn't really concerned about having to carry too much cash flow if it just met her certain metrics. So earlier this year, as we headed into COVID, we knew, we had some tenants that were going to struggle. There were a couple restaurant tenants that were going to struggle. There were some other tenants that were going to struggle. The thing we didn't expect to see is the name of the tenant in the newspaper. And one of the tenants in this is a 2,000, 2,500 square foot user that is a quote unquote spa. Well, of course, this spa's employees were arrested for sex crimes and for money laundering. And the client calls me and goes, what do we do? And I said, well, the owner / tenant has not been named. These were employees. The employees and the money that was confiscated were not on the premises. It was in a private residence in the city. And I said, and it doesn't necessarily reflect poorly on your little center, but we need to be attentive to it. I said, so tell me about the client. Are we having any issues? And he goes, no, the client's paying rent. The client's paying its CAMs. We have 5 years to run on this lease. The rent is a little bit below market, but in light of COVID, there's nothing we can do. And I said, well, what we have to do is just put the tenant on notice. So we sent them a letter, not really a default letter, but a letter that indicated that we are aware of this. Here is the clause of your lease that would apply. We're not accusing you of anything, but we expect and intend that you address these issues, and the issues of your employees do not become issues on the premises. And that's exactly what's happened. The tenant remains, the tenant continues to function. We've had no further complaints. There have been no further allegations, no further investigations. And I think it was the appropriate solution. Anytime we start to fight with tenants or we seek to evict tenants, there are transaction costs, there are litigation costs. It's difficult in Idaho. The only way that we can really quickly evict tenants, and I reviewed Kansas and Missouri law, and they appear to be somewhat similar, is that if a tenant's not paying, we can obviously take action and get some degree of summary relief. But if the argument is that the tenant has, sex workers on site, that's a different and more difficult thing to terminate. So we obviously don't want to create a nuisance. We don't want to create a situation that devalues our relationship with our other tenants. And so that's how we dealt with it. And that was one of the things where it was very important to know who we were dealing with. When you're dealing with a tenant, most tenants these days are going to organize with some limited liability company, maybe an S corporation. It's just customary and it's easy. And that's why it's critical to know who your tenant is, where your tenant is, how we work through these relationships, and make sure that we are dealing with the actual person. That was part of the problem that we had, obviously, when we got taken on the Rascal Flats DSK Toby Keith thing, is they had layered that entity in such a way that the mobster's name never appeared in any of the documents we dealt with. Even as we dealt with and went back into the corporate documents, it was virtually impossible if you did not know the individuals to know and identify the problems and the situations with how they structured it. Now, when we talk about limited liability companies, that's where it becomes incredibly important for us to do our due diligence with respect to our tenants. Because most of the time, a tenant's going to come to us, want to lease in a limited liability company, and it's going to be thinly capitalized. The only resources are the personal resources of the members of the limited liability company. And as many of you know, when we're dealing with a mom and pop, that's the extent of the assets. And so a guarantee from the individuals that are members of the limited liability company may not be worth anything more than what we already have with the lease. And that's where we need to evaluate what other resources are there. If we get a guarantee, though, we need a guarantee from every member of the limited liability company. Don't accept a guarantee from one member. Pursue it for everybody so that we can have joint and several liability. Because what we have seen is transactions where you have one guarantor and they for whatever reason may seek to cut a deal quickly or do something else, and you just don't have the leverage. And we need to make sure that we actually review financials that make sense, and financials that have the information that we have. When I ask clients, have you reviewed their financials? They go, oh yeah, we took a look at their bank account. And I'm like, their bank account is not the whole analysis. You know, we need a financial statement. We need to know what other debts and liabilities do they have out there? What other assets do they have? Are they liquid? It's not enough just to look at the bank account. So what else do we need to do? Well, I want to share with you now about what do we do with franchisees, because I have found that in COVID, we've continued to see activity amongst franchisees seeking to lease space. And remember that the franchisee is not the franchisor. And again, I've had some of my owner clients that struggle with this concept. The franchisee is only as strong as the franchisor's concept, and only as strong as the performance of the franchisee. There are businesses that get franchised every day who I am convinced that the sole purpose of the business is to sell franchise services, not necessarily sell the services that the franchise delivers. Not everybody's McDonald's, not everybody has, you know, that degree of delivery and corporate brand and quality. So there is, I don't know what you know about Idaho, but Sun Valley resort area in the central part of Idaho, in the Wood River Valley, there are several towns up there, Ketchum, Bellevue, the city of Sun Valley, the city of Haley. And there was a Tex-Mex chain out of the Wood River Valley that actually had multiple locations up there. And people here in Boise, you know, we drive the 2.5 hours over to Sun Valley to ski, to golf, to recreate. And this local Sun Valley Tex-Mex chain announced that they were franchising and they were coming to Boise. So we're dealing with a small franchisor to begin with. I think we were under 10 units at that point. And my client had a mixed-use office retail project park at the intersection of what is arguably the second busiest intersection in the state of Idaho. It is a main state highway that's coming off the interstate next to a large medical center, and it has another major thoroughfare. And so Eagle Road is the busiest road in Idaho, and Franklin and Eagle, where this is located, is arguably the second or third busiest intersection on Eagle Road. It's the main north-south connector for Boise's western suburbs. So we have a 500,000 square foot medical office campus, 3 towers, and then we had about 70,000 square feet of retail at this intersection. Great location on paper. It is a challenge though for access, because the intersection is so busy, because it's a state highway. access is severely restricted. We've had significant right-of-way takes and other things that have further limited things. To get in, you have to take a circuitous route. Now, we had some tenants in there that have done incredibly well. I mean, Buffalo Wild Wings opened there, anchored it, and just has gone gangbusters in the nearly 10 years that they've been there. They've expanded, they've done all sorts of stuff. But this franchisee takes space that on paper would look good. It was part of a building that the other tenant was a Starbucks drive-through. And it's a good building, it's out on the corner, but Starbucks drive-through functions really, really well because it is on the right side of the road when people are going to work. You can make an easy right in, right out, hit the Starbucks and be on your way without having to make any circuitous routes. To get there in hours that aren't the morning rush hour, it takes a circuitous route. And so this Tex-Mex chain opened up there, and it was a difficult negotiation, and it became readily apparent that we were dealing with somebody that this was their first franchise. This was very early for this franchisor. They didn't have the degree of sophistication, and they were both the franchisee and franchisor were poorly capitalized. And while the franchisor made commitments, we just could never get the franchisor to follow through on those commitments. And they were commitments that are beyond what you typically see in those franchisor addendums. So we struggle with this tenant, and this tenant struggles. This tenant is now months behind on rent, is behind on CAMs, is complaining about the access. And we're like, you knew what it was when you took it. You didn't fully evaluate it. And it was not going well. And the client reaches out and goes, we got to do something. What are we going to do? Because we were in there the other day and the quality of the food is horrible. It's not at all like it is at the motherships in Sun Valley. And I go, well, of course it isn't. What did we really think? And they go, well, we thought that we were signing a deal with the Tex-Mex. And I go, no, you signed a deal with the franchisee. And they go, we just got to get them out. They're getting behind. They're problematic. They're damaging the center. So they hadn't paid rent for 3 months, and they were about 6 months behind on CAMs. And they go, what can we do? And I go, well, the only thing we can do in Idaho, the one power that we have is the ability to throw people out who aren't paying rent with a 3-day notice to quit. And they go, great. Put that together. Let's go get it served. So I assume, as is the case in your states, if you're going to serve a notice to quit or pay rent before initiating an unlawful detainer, you either have to go deliver it or you have to go post it on the property. And I hand this assignment off to one of the associates in my firm. And I just said, hey, Nick, we need a 3-day notice to quit to the Tex-Mex place. Make it happen. Well, lo and behold, Nick made it happen on Cinco de Mayo. And my firm mocked me to no end for trying to evict a Tex-Mex restaurant on Cinco de Mayo. And my response to that was, at least I knew they would be open that day. And shortly thereafter, they vacated, and we repurposed that space. For something that wasn't food service, and it's now an orthodontist. Better rent, access is less of an issue. So when you're dealing with franchises, and I recently negotiated a series of leases with a franchisee who I was surprised at the degree of interaction and intervention that the franchisor had in those negotiations. And I expressed some concern to the tenant, to my client, the owner, about this tenant, because another of my clients had passed on this user. And, what do we know about the franchisee? Well, in this case, the franchisee is a successful local businesswoman, but this would be her 3rd location that she has opened for this franchise. And it's the 3rd location. She's got personal guarantees on all the other ones, and she opens each and every one of them up in a separate entity, a separate limited liability company. That posed some questions and concerns. And the franchisor was really aggressive in negotiating assignment clauses, which again jumps up and gave me some concern. We went through it, and ultimately, I said to the client, I said, this is a business decision for you. And the business decision that the client made was, we had had food service in this space. It had not worked. It had failed several times. And to support the other food service, it made sense to have a non-food service franchise. And we made that decision and moved forward. And the client made some meaningful concessions to do it, and not knowing concessions. So last kind of thing I want to share, and last thing is last of these anecdotes that frame this discussion, is I am convinced that tenants will always push you. Tenants are like your kids. And I used to say that tenants are like toddlers. And then my kids grew up and I realized that tenants are more like teenagers. Because tenants as toddlers, I always found my kids when they were little, they'd tell you a really good story. They'd tell you a phenomenal story that became even more grandiose and better as time went on. And at times, I kind of like to hear those stories. The other thing too with my kids when they were little is if you were not absolutely consistent, the first time you didn't do what you said you were going to do, they would call you out and hold it over you forever as fundamentally changing the social contract. And if you didn't consistently enforce, bedtimes and other things like that, you just always got pushback. It was just push, push, push. Now I've come to appreciate that now tenants are more like teenagers. They're not going to turn off the lights. They're going to roll their eyes at you. They're going to badmouth you to other people. They're going to talk back, and they're just going to be obstinate. So represent a regional retail owner that invests in large, existing, and usually distressed strip shopping centers anchored by large box retail. So it's just your prototypical grocery anchored or soft goods anchored strip. And they do tend to buy distressed assets and repurpose them and really upgrade them and get a good return on them. So they had negotiated with a tenant to open a salon. And this tenant is a multi-salon location. It's not a franchisor relationship. It's directly with a national operator. And the negotiations have been very difficult. The negotiations had dragged on, and the negotiations were such that the landlord's general counsel had negotiated in a hard start date on rent commencement. Wasn't tied to tenant improvement completion, wasn't tied to occupancy. They gave the tenant 9 months, then with a hard start on rent of February 1st of 2020. Well, there were a variety of delays in completing the tenant improvements. There were a variety of delays caused by the tenant not communicating with the landlord for things that needed to be incorporated in landlord work. And then there were delays caused by COVID to get it permitted. So this spring, the tenant starts to push back. It's like, oh, force majeure applies. We can't do this. We can't work through this. You've got to let us out. You've got to do other stuff. And the client's like, no, we negotiated with you. We negotiated throughout 2019. We finished these in early 2020. We need to move forward. So we agreed to defer rent for a period equal to the delay caused by us getting some permitting things through. And again, it was tenant driven. We had to relocate a rooftop unit and some ventilation, and the tenant hadn't delivered plans. And so there was some stuff there, but the client goes, okay, in interest of good faith, we'll give you 2 months. So tenant finally gets their permits and comes back, and our architect had missed a wall. Space was off, and there was a material defect in the configuration of the wall. No idea how it happened, but it was there. And the result is some of the tenant's work wouldn't work, but the space now was also, 120 square feet larger. And the tenant came back and goes, oh, force majeure, we're not going to do this. And tenant is represented by a litigation attorney here in town that I've had dealings with, good guy. And he reached out to me and he goes, after he found out I was representing, goes, Jeff, we got to get this on the rails. And I'm like, dude, your client is the problem. We've been incredibly cautious. We've been incredibly gracious. We've been incredibly cooperative. how do we fix this? And he goes, well, my client is insistent that we do X, Y, and Z. And I go, Daniel, did you look at the lease? Do you realize how we got here? And he's like, no. I said, let's get my client on the phone. So we got everybody on the phone. We worked through it. And, my client is a little frustrated because it is a difficult tenant and it's been a difficult process, and everything they knew that could happen did. So as we worked through that one and worked through others with COVID, we've been very sensitive to the fact that our goal is to keep tenants in, keep them paying as much rent as possible. To the extent we have to do workouts, we do workouts that are going to defer some rent now, but tack it on the back end, extend these terms, and make sure that they are performing. At the end of the day, it's about getting tenants current. It's about extending terms. It's about making sure that our properties can weather this difficult times. And with that, if you have any questions, more than willing to answer them.
We got a good question. What's the strangest lawsuit you've been involved in?
What is the strangest real estate lawsuit that I've been involved in, or strangest?
Just any kind of lawsuit. We'll take any topic.
We'll take any topic.
Yeah.
Okay. As a very, very young attorney, I had to screen all of the calls for potential new stuff. And I get the call one day from somebody that wanted us to sue General Motors. And I start doing the intake and visiting with the lady. And this isn't the strangest lawsuit because I refuse to take it. So that's the caveat. I do have standards. But she called and goes, I wrecked my boyfriend's car and the airbag went off and it messed up my nose and makeup and I want to sue GM. And I'm like, so you crashed his car and the airbag worked as appropriate? Well, yeah, but I go, how did you crash his car? And she's like, well, I was putting my makeup on and I drove into the ditch. So it's the airbag shouldn't have damaged my nose. And I just said, lady, the airbag worked as expected and you shouldn't put your makeup on while you're driving down the road. I like to think of myself as the defender of the universe and trying to keep bad things from happening. And in the real estate context, I try to discourage clients from doing crazy stuff. But, yes, I did evict a Tex-Mex restaurant started the eviction on Cinco de Mayo. And I'm actually quite proud of that one because I thought that showed initiative on my part.
You did know that they would be open.
We did know they would be open.
You did know that. Okay, so the next question is back to the Toby Keith deal. Were owners paying TIs before the lease was fully executed? If the lease was fully executed, why was there no recourse?
So landlords were paying TI, lease was executed. And the way that they were structuring these was, we need 50% of the TIs up front to get the design work and materials underway because this is going to be so nice and upscale. So there was always a push to get the lease signed. Lease gets signed, checks are cut to tenant to go start TIs. But again, the tenant was always created with a special entity that was a single purpose asset that you didn't know who the people were. And when we went, the way that we dealt with Rascal Flats, because they disappeared, we filed an action to evict for non-performance, and we couldn't effectuate service because we couldn't find the owner. So that's why there was no recourse, because somebody who doesn't want to get found, who doesn't have assets, and who is scamming you will disappear with your money quite quickly, and you're just not going to be able to. You're not going to be able to claw it back.
That's great. Okay. Well, thank you. I don't see any more questions. Give everybody a second. Do you have anything else you want to ask Jeff?
Well, I'm grateful that Crystal reached out and called. Most of the time when people call me and ask me to talk to locals, it's about government affairs stuff. And to be honest, government affairs is important. As I shared with Crystal, I was at the Idaho legislature yesterday taking a loss on government affairs. But it is a lot more fun to talk about, in my mind, what is the perfect lease? How do we do it the right way? And that's kind of my great white whale, is I'm always looking for the perfect lease that we don't have any problems with, and I haven't found it yet. So.
Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for spending your morning with us after a very busy yesterday and upcoming today. So
Well,
thank you
Crystal.
all.
Oh, and everybody, if Crystal hasn't told you, make sure you pay your $25 to BOMA Pack and get your BOMA masks.
Yes, Geoffrey is the chair of our Government Affairs Committee for BOMA International, and I'm the co-chair of BOMA PAC Council, which is part of Government Affairs. So yes, get your PAC contributions in. You have links in your newsletter that went out on Tuesday. Thank you all. Have a great day. Thank you, Geoffrey. I appreciate it.
Thanks. You guys take care.